That is a sailor's home. It may not look like it. It's about as far from the sea as a home's likely to be. We're facing north. Surprised. The closest bit of the ocean then would be 900 miles behind me. That would be the Gulf of Mexico. The Atlantic would be 1,000 miles to the right, the Pacific 2,000 miles to the west. I grew up in this home. We moved into it in 1946 or 47 when I would have been 4 or 5 years old. These homes on this street, called Dorak Lane, were built by returning servicemen from the Second World War, for returning servicemen. My stepfather and my father were both in the Army in the Second World War. Neither saw combat. They built the first 8 houses on that side of the street first, and then they built the 4 up a year or 2 later up around the turnabout up there. This is a dead-end street. And then a few years later they built the ones behind me. You go in that front door and there's a stairway. To the right is the dining room, to the left the living room, behind the dining room the kitchen, behind the living room my parents' bedroom. Upstairs to the right was my room, to the left was my mother's mother and her stepfather's room. I was not close to any of those people. Out back now there's a subdivision. When I grew up it was an open field, and I used to be in my room and I used to look out over that field. No one in my family had sailed, no one had any interest in the water. I was an only child, and it took. I spent most of my time alone reading. There were other kids in the neighborhood. We played softball and basketball and things, but I had no close friends. I've said that I was formed by the myths of the American West and ancient Greece. As we drove across the Mississippi yesterday, I took a photo of the arch. The Gateway Arch wasn't there then. It was built when I was in college. But it was an apt symbol for St. Louis, which was once the gateway to the West. And my mind went that way, toward the ocean. This is not an attempt at nostalgia. I have no happy memories of my childhood. There are some advantages to that kind of an upbringing. It makes you self-reliant, independent, and it makes you distrust authority figures, which historically is proven again and again, as I talk in the Ukraine. We're going to move on to another site which was important to me when I was young. This was the next most important, maybe the equally important building for me when I was growing up, the Kirkwood Public Library. I've always been a reader. I used to be down, it's about a mile from where the house was. And I used to be down here and checking out books. When I finished whatever I had, I'd be back and getting more. I read books of biographies of great men as how-to books, usually being disappointed in that one moment they were unknown and the next they were famous. I didn't read specifically about the sea. I read about flying, I read about explorers. I did read Slocum, I read Conrad. Back then the sailing magazines were Yachting and Rudder. I read both of those. The big issue of yachting was the January issue, was the New York Boat Show issue. It often ran 300-400 pages of advertising. And I admired particularly a boat called The Medalist, designed I think by Tripp, built by LeCompte, about 32, 33 feet. And I saw one when I had Gannett in San Diego. I also read the National Geographic articles by Irving Johnson, who with his wife X.E. sailed brigantine Yankees around the world, I think 7 times. They used to leave from New England and take 18 months with a paid amateur crew. And I remember a movie called Windjammer, a Cinerama movie about Scandinavian training ship. Well, I never sailed any of those kinds of boats, but my mind did go west to the sea, and when my grandparents retired, my grandparents, that being my father's mother and her last husband, who I thought of as my grandfather. She was never divorced, she just outlived 3 husbands. When they retired to California, little beach house in San Diego, I spent my summers with them. And as I have said, saw boats, and although I had never sailed, knew no one who sailed, that's what I knew I was going to do. And to write about it. I've always thought of myself as a writer more than a sailor. I suppose I must have sensed as a child, and I certainly know as an adult, that my mother and stepfather got rid of me every opportunity they had, and my grandmother, that my father's mother, and my grandfather had me with them whenever they could. Driving around here, none of it looks the same. This building's the same. This is one of the few things that look familiar. It looks more familiar to me than the house I grew up in. But naturally, it's been 60 years. I have liked to quantify things, and I have said one way to quantify if you're a good parent is that when your children become adults, if they voluntarily spend time with you. I know several people who meet that test. I never saw my mother and stepfather once I became an adult. I graduated from college in Iowa, about 300 miles north of here, and drove for California the very next day. I've only been back here once before. When the year Carol and I were married, we drove through on the way from Plano, Texas, where we picked up her cat, back to Boston. Only stayed a few hours, went up the arch and drove on. So I've not been back here for 60 years, and naturally it all looks different. This is the corner basically of 8th and Pine. There used to be a hotel right there called the Mark Twain Hotel. There's another hotel in town in St. Louis called the Mark Twain. It's not the same hotel. It was at least 11 stories high. It was demolished in 1976. I know it was 11 stories high because my father jumped out of the 11-story window, I think toward the back of the building, landed on a parking garage 2 or 3 stories high behind it, and died on the way to the hospital. He was in his 30s, maybe 36, 37. That was 1949. I never knew him. He and my mother separated before I was born. Never knew the story of how they met or why they separated. I saw him perhaps 20 minutes in my life, 2 times for about 10 minutes each. I learned an important lesson by the negativity of that, in that if you have children, you own them a lot for a very long time. It was a responsibility that I did not think I could fulfill and live my life as I wanted to live it. His death meant nothing to me personally. It changed my name. His last name was Tedford. My last name was Tedford when I was born. After his suicide, I was legally adopted by my stepfather and changed to Childs. Wrote a poem about what was found in his pockets. I can't remember the exact words, some coins. I found them in my grandmother's house, the one in San Diego that I inherited after she died. She never talked about him either. He was her only child. She kept a picture of him on a coffee table in her living room all her life. So, the world changes pretty much in every 20 years. You go back to a place you've lived 20 years later and you find there's not a mark that you ever existed there. This has certainly changed. I remember I commented to Carol after looking at the house that I grew up in. It seemed smaller even than I remembered. In 1957, end of the year, I was 16 years old and got my driver's license, which was very important to me, as it is to all the young. Curiously, when I gave up my driver's license a few years ago because of my vision, I didn't miss it at all. But borrowing my parents' car, I was able to get to places I couldn't have before by myself. This is one of the important ones, the St. Louis Art Museum. That's St. Louis himself up there. If I remember correctly, that was Louis the X, maybe, of France, who went on one of the Crusades and died, I think, in Tunisia. This park was, this forest park, it's a nice park. It was the site of the 1904 World's Fair. I was able to come here and be exposed to some great art, some beauty, and frankly a better world. It's a nice day here in St. Louis, in the low 70s Fahrenheit, about 21, 22 centigrade. A lot of people out. That's Carol. We're going to go inside and see what there is to see.